Well, I have very much enjoyed this week so far. I hope you have too. I'm aware, as a former student, of the difficulty of morning classes. I know that this is not as early as it could be. I know you probably have 8 o'clock classes wherever you're from. And I had the thankless task yesterday of doing the after-lunch crowd, too, and everyone's blood is in their digestive system and not in their brains. But I have to say I'm very, very impressed with what I've seen among you Mises University students this week. I gave my talk yesterday, and in spite of the after lunchtime slot, I was outside for a solid 2 hours talking to some of you who were interested in environmental issues. And it's something that I enjoy talking about, of course, but I rarely get such an interested and well-informed audience. And so I enjoy that very much. And I don't even have to grade your tests. So for those of you that might not have been here yesterday, my name is Timothy Terrell. I teach economics at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And I was a Mises Fellow here many years ago while I was doing my doctoral work here at Auburn. And I have to say that my appreciation for what this institute is doing and the publishing efforts that it has made and the extent to which it has made inroads into the internet discussion on markets has only impressed me more as time has gone on. And I know that some of you are new to the activities of the Institute and you're not perhaps as familiar as you will be later with what we do here, but this is a very impressive institution, and I can recall when its facilities were rented facilities in the basement of the business building, and the extent to which this has grown is very impressive to me and, of course, gratifying as well. Now, what I'd like to do today is talk about some of the common objections to capitalism. If you this is not an exhaustive list. People keep coming up with new things to complain about, but there are a lot of the same things too. And I thought I'd go through 10 of these with you today. Some of these are more sophisticated than others. I find that sometimes it's like shooting fish in a barrel, and other times you really have to try to figure out what that other person is saying and which part of your economics training or philosophy to bring to bear on the argument. Now, let me make a couple of things clear. Some people will define capitalism as a free market economy, like what we have in Western industrialized society, and then proceed to blame capitalism for whatever they don't like about Western industrialized society. And I'm going to borrow here from philosopher Roderick Long. He has this wonderful little example. He says, suppose I invent the word Zacks and Backs. He says, I define it as a metallic sphere like the Washington Monument. Well, I then proceed to show that a Zacks and Backs would be better if it were rounder and shinier and not so tall and pointy. Well, we have, I'm doing a talk tomorrow on healthcare economics, and I run into the same kind of problem in that field where people will say, well, I don't like the American healthcare system. Capitalism doesn't work because some people don't have health insurance and because medical costs are rising. And see, that's what capitalism does. This is completely off base. We don't have a capitalist-dominated healthcare system or much of anything else. Frankly, it's a little tiring to constantly have to defend capitalism over against the failures of socialism. It's the problems that people complain about are very often traceable to the socialist elements of our system and not to the remaining slivers of capitalism we have left. Well, let's look at one of these, and I'll just go through these. Some of these will move faster than others. But first, there's this argument that capitalism exploits the poor. And you've probably seen pictures like this if you've had, your typical high school, junior high history classes, and the little kids working on the textile looms and working in the coal mines, and the dirty-faced Welsh coal mining kids, and kids working in the fields at age 5 or whatnot. And this is supposed to be the product of capitalism. Now, I have one of my favorite little books, and it's been around for a long, long time. It's actually a series of lectures that Ludwig von Mises gave in Buenos Aires in the 1950s, I think 1956 or so. But it's a really, really good book, and it's so applicable today, even though it's over 50 years old. And that's Economic Policy, Thoughts for Today and Tomorrow. And if you haven't picked up a copy of this, it's excellent. And Mises says here that it's actually quite easy to answer this argument from the anti-capitalist. He says, and this is over 50 years ago, so some of these numbers would have changed, but he says, the population of this planet is now 10 times greater than it was in the ages preceding capitalism. You know that all men today enjoy a higher standard of living than your ancestors did before the age of capitalism. But how do you know that you are the 1 out of 10 who would have lived in the absence of capitalism? He says the mere fact that you are alive today to argue with me about capitalism is a sign of the triumph of capitalism. You're alive today. He says whether or not you consider your own life very valuable, you are a product of capitalism, most likely. He says it's a fact, and this is interesting here, and you can find this same kind of thing elsewhere, but it's a fact that the hatred of capitalism originated not with the masses, not among the workers themselves, but among the landed aristocracy, the gentry, the nobility of England and the European continent. They blamed capitalism for something that was not very pleasant for them. He says at the beginning of the 19th century, the higher wages paid by industry to its workers forced the landed aristocracy to pay higher wages to their workers. Well, they didn't like this, so they started coming up with this kind of thing. Not the photographs, but the kinds of objections that industrial capitalism is exploiting the poor. Of course, Mises says, from our viewpoint, the workers' standard of living was extremely low. And the conditions under early capitalism were absolutely shocking. I mean, these are not fabricated photographs. It is kind of shocking to our modern sensibilities to see a kid that looked like he's maybe 8 or 9 or 10 years old working on a loom. We think, well, he should be in school. And the assumption is, presented by the anti-capitalist, well, if we could only ban this kind of thing, or if we could only stop capitalism from exploiting children, from exploiting the poor, then that child would be in school. Mises says no. He says the famous old story, repeated hundreds of times, that the factories employed women and children, and that these women and children, before they were working in the factories, had lived under satisfactory conditions, is one of the greatest falsehoods of history. The mothers who worked in the factories had nothing to cook with. They did not leave their homes and their kitchens to go into the factories. They went into the factories because they had no kitchens. And if they had a kitchen, they had no food to cook in those kitchens. And the children did not come from comfortable nurseries. They were starving and dying. And he goes on to say, one of the proofs that capitalism benefited the masses is that in precisely those years of the Industrial Revolution, in those early years, the population of England and of the other countries that adopted capitalistic factory systems, the population exploded because children who would have died in infancy or early childhood now, because of the higher standard of living, survived into adulthood. Art Carden, and I can point you to the source later if you like, but Art Carden had an article recently in which he said that the sources of mortality have fallen, and this is in particular infant mortality and maternal mortality. They're tiny fractions of what they used to be. Life expectancy has increased radically. Carden says that the life expectancy at the height of the Roman Empire was 24 years old. In Britain, at the end of the 15th century, it was 30. In the United States, at the beginning of the 20th century, after much of the Industrial Revolution had taken place, it was 45. What's the life expectancy today for someone born alive in the United States? Pushing 80. This is a product of capitalism. I wonder, and maybe this is, you look at some of the anti-capitalist crowd, and they go to developing countries, and they say, well, see, capitalism is destroying this culture because it's bringing in all of this consumerism. It's exploiting these families. They're now living in shacks at the margin of some large city, and they're working in a factory or they're unemployed. And see, this is the product of capitalism, they say. Okay, well, I'm not quite sure what their view is of what these people came from, but typically people don't try to move into a situation that's going to make them worse off. If they're better off with their plot of land in the countryside, farming potatoes or whatever they're doing, they're not going to move toward the city and work in a factory because that's going to make them worse off. They've always got that option of moving or staying in the agricultural society. But agricultural labor is typically more dangerous. Even in the United States today, agricultural labor is more dangerous and pays less than industrial labor. All right, I don't know whether we're supposed to preserve these pre-capitalistic societies as a sort of a zoo where we go along and we look at that culture. It's pre-capitalist. Isn't that wonderful? And meanwhile, the people in that culture are saying, we would love to be able to enjoy some of the benefits of capitalism, but we don't have them because of an oppressive government or something that's preventing us from trading and expanding like the rest of the world did. All right, then we have a second argument. Capitalism is unjust. And there's, of course, the wealth distribution argument. Mises has another wonderful book. I don't have it here with me to show you, but it's called The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality. And again, I know you're reading a lot, and there's a lot that you've probably been confronted with this week that you'd like to get a hold of and read, but that's another one that you should put on your list at some point, The Anti-Capitalistic Mentality. And Mises goes, I'm not going to read this long quote here that I have from this text, but Mises says it's a delusion to say that nature has endowed everyone with a certain amount of stuff and a certain rights. He says it's a fallacy to say that nature is sort of open-handed to everyone who's born, and there's plenty of everything for everybody, and therefore the chief problem is how to allocate this abundance to everyone. He says it's a fallacy to say that everyone has this fair and equal claim against everyone else for the full portion of nature's bounty. Now, he says everything about that is false. Nature's not bountiful. Nature is stingy. There's scarcity. It is difficult to get things out of the ground, to make our living. He says nature has restricted the supply of all things indispensable for the preservation of human life. So he says the reason we're better off today than scrabbling around in the dirt in some sort of primitive condition is because of human endeavors to preserve and expand our well-being. It's the skill with which we utilize nature that has made us better off. So he says it's nonsense to refer to some sort of natural principle of a just distribution of wealth. There's no definite quantity of machines or consumer goods that has to be distributed among the various nations. But commonly you get this perception or perspective from the anti-capitalist who will say something like, well, the reason that the developing, by the way, developing nation, I don't really like the term. It's very optimistic. Some of these countries are not developing. They're poor and they're staying poor and they don't seem to be getting any better. To refer to a country like Zimbabwe as developing is just to be lying. Okay, so if you want to use a politically incorrect term like third world or something like that, that's fine. But it's not that the capitalistic nations of the world went in and exploited these poorer nations and that's why they're poor. Now, in some cases, you can certainly point to a country in sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East, and you can say, well, see, the capitalist nations messed that country up. And in some cases, they did. I mean, the colonial powers would come in and they'd sort of draw lines through the desert, and they'd split a tribe in half, and they'd put two people together that don't get along and have never gotten along for centuries, and they expect that these people, because we're going to put democracy in, that these people are somehow going to get along. This is what Murray Rothbard called the problem of the geographical abortion of Yugoslavia. And I'm forgetting now where Rothbard said this, but this is one of the problems that the industrialized nations did contribute to the poverty of the third world, is trying to create these nation states where, in fact, people would be much better off if they were apart, if they were separate, independent tribes and interacting as more or less sovereign groups. Anyway, that's a sidetrack. But if there is a problem in the developing nations from the Western industrialized world, it's because the Western industrialized world's imperialist tendencies, and not because of some sort of capitalist move toward industrialization or free trade or any other attribute of true capitalism. All right. Then you get this argument, capitalism doesn't make us happy. And I had assigned a few readings for you, one by a man named Cameron Mofid, an article called Global Capitalism in Crisis, and he says, well, Western wealth creation leads to depression, it leads to neuroses, it leads to anxiety, and we have all these people that are scrambling around trying to make a living, and they're not really at peace with themselves, and they're all on Prozac or some sort of medication, and we're struggling with obesity and negative self-perceptions and all of these kinds of things. And people in southern Ethiopia don't spend billions of dollars on diet and slimming products to try to combat obesity. Well, of course not. They have a more serious problem. Starvation. So in a way you could say there's a trade-off. And of course, in a free society, I'm not going to dictate what makes you happy. You decide what makes you happy. And there are people who make mistakes, and they go off and they pursue some goal, and they accomplish the goal, and they find out, well, I'm now a multimillionaire and still not happy. Well, I can't tell you that making more money is the key to your happiness. I mean, maybe happiness for you is dispensing with your worldly goods and sitting on a mountaintop. Maybe that's fine. There's nothing anti-capitalist about trying to do that kind of thing. Pursue it. Pursue your happiness however you like. People are maybe unhappy when they're wealthy. There's a kind of a debate over whether people with more money are happier than people with less money. But certainly you look at the poor and you say, well, what would it do for you if you lived a longer, healthier life, if you had a better education, if you had less infant mortality, your children don't die in infancy, mothers don't die in childbirth as often, if you have a more varied diet, and a diet that is consistent, you're not really worried about how you're going to eat next week. If you had easier communication with your family and friends, cheap communication, cheap travel, if you have the ability to see new places, all of those things really are the product of a system of freedom and markets. So it's almost as if Moffitt is saying, if a free economy can't make us free of all anxiety and free of depression, and then it's a failure and it needs to be replaced with something like interventionism or socialism. Well, this makes a problem-free life the enemy of a good life. The perfect becomes the enemy of the good. Well, a free economy may not be sufficient to produce morality, it may not be sufficient to produce happiness, but it certainly doesn't hurt. And certainly if you look at unfree economies, you see people living in such conditions that you wonder how they're not in utter despair. And I think sometimes they really are. Maybe they would be on Prozac, except they can't find Prozac in that country because of the anti-capitalistic system. All right, third. Capitalism doesn't account for non-material goals. Well, critics of capitalism will often admit, capitalism does a great job of producing stuff, but it's morally bad. And they'll argue that economic thinking excludes these non-material goals. And Moffitt has this term, economism. He says economism is regarding human societies primarily as economic systems in which economic considerations alone govern our choice and decisions. And then you have Tawney in a book called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, who says a reasonable estimate of economic organization must allow for the fact that unless industry is to be paralyzed by recurrent revolts on the part of outraged human nature, it must satisfy criteria that are not purely economic. Now, I think that here there's a perversion, a twisting of the term economic. The non-economist is often prone to thinking of economics as being about dollars. Anything you can't count in dollars doesn't count. Well, economics is about how we use resources, how people behave to allocate resources to accomplish their goals. So if I give food charitably to my neighbor, then I'm using resources to accomplish a goal. I'm acting as a human individual to accomplish a goal of mine, and my goal might be to see my neighbor fed. And if I choose charity to accomplish that goal, that's no less economic than if I ask my neighbor, well, why don't you mow my grass and I'll give you $20 and then you can eat. It's not as though one is an economic situation and another is a non-economic situation. So Moffitt persists in saying, well, and this, I'm using Moffitt as kind of a touchstone here, but this is common. Well, there's values like faith and spirituality and justice and love and compassion and sympathy and empathy and cooperation. And he says capitalism is opposed to these things. Well, let's take the first item on his list, faith. Faith requires action, human action. Sound familiar? Human action. Human action brings us into the realm of praxeology and of economics. Defining wealth depends on your goals. The thing is valued as part of our physical wealth only because it helps us to accomplish something we want to do. And if our goals include so-called spiritual goals, like maybe feeding the hungry or clothing the naked or housing the homeless or healing the sick, access to material things helps us accomplish those things. Now, if you want to be an ascetic, you can do that. Reject modern tools. You can reject modern consumption goods to some extent. But capitalism is not going to undermine your ability to seek those ascetic goals if that's what you choose to do. All right. Next. Oh, you know, one thing I left off here that I meant to point out. One of the other books or articles that I asked you to look at was one by Weinberg. And Weinberg, just briefly, he says, well, there's this tyranny of employers and a tyranny of insurance companies and a tyranny of HMOs, and we need government to protect us from this. This is exactly what he says. He says, to say that any worker is free to escape an oppressive employer by getting a different job is about as realistic as to say that any citizen is free to escape an oppressive government by immigrating. Now, I recently had a dispute with my auto insurance company about a claim. But I didn't worry that my insurance company was going to put me in jail or kill me. I can switch insurance companies in less than an hour if I'm not happy. Now, if I'm not happy with my tax bill, how hard is it for me to leave the tax jurisdiction? A good bit more difficult. So for somebody like Weinberg to say, well, you know, the tyranny of your HMO is like, we can set that on a par with the tyranny that you're complaining about in your government. We actually need government to protect you from the tyranny of these little market organizations that you can very easily leave. I changed jobs 10 years ago because I thought that my previous employer was undervaluing my labor. I got something like a 25-30% pay increase by changing jobs. My previous employer apparently had been underestimating what I was worth on the market. And then the hypocrisy of this kind of thing, to say government needs to protect you from the tyranny of your insurance company or the tyranny of your HMO or your employer. Well, there's a really thick book that I have on my shelf in my office called The Black Book of Communism. And this is just one aspect of statism, communist variety. But you only need to point to the hundreds of millions of people killed by war and political purges and genocide and state-induced famine in the last century, the political imprisonment of millions, the slave camps, the Kristallnachts, the police brutality, the siege warfare of modern economic sanctions against nations, and these other horrors produced by governments, to say, you know, this perspective you've got, Weinberg, is a bit warped. Just, you know, I don't know how many people insurance companies have killed, but it's got to be a lot less than the number of people killed by governments. All right. Well, you've been looking at this for a while, and it's a very interesting little drawing here. And you sort of, if you've taken a class in a number of a variety of disciplines in your undergraduate education, you probably hear the message this little drawing here is trying to convey. Capitalism is aesthetically obnoxious and environmentally irresponsible. Well, I talked a little bit yesterday toward the end of my lecture about BP and the problems with the oil spill in the Gulf. And I said, you know, this is not some sort of failure of capitalism. You can point to any number of government interventions, and I mentioned about 4 or 5 yesterday. Interventions which led oil companies to drill in more risky locations, deepwater locations, which encouraged oil companies to take more risk by capping their risk at $75 million. That caused the government-owned oil rights to be auctioned off at prices that probably ignored some of the opportunity costs of that ocean territory. And then, of course, you can look at the environmental record of countries that have had more statism than we have had in the United States. Environmental destruction is incredible. But let's take this aesthetic sort of opposition to capitalism. Again, I'll refer to the anti-capitalistic mentality by Mises, and he says, only romantic prepossession can induce an observer to ignore the fact that more and more citizens of the capitalistic countries live in an environment which cannot be simply dismissed as ugly. Now, I wrote an article several years ago in a reaction. I write most of my articles because I get worked up about something that somebody has said, and I had a colleague of mine in the English department who they're snickering. I don't know why. I met a young undergraduate here yesterday who's an English major, and I thought, this is so wonderful. We've got somebody who's got free market leanings who's going into English. More power to you, because you're going to need it. But anyway, he had taken some students on a tour of the of part of the East Coast, and he said, it's a bad idea to turn the whole future of a region over only to people with money to make. And he says that the whole landscape of, he went through North Carolina's coast and part of South Carolina's coast, I guess Virginia's coast, and he says there were neglected landscapes. Neglected. Now what he means by neglected is that land use has been left to market forces rather than being regulated by a group of central planners. He says, for 2 days we'd passed miles and miles of shabby strip malls, big box development blocks, say that 3 times fast, and back-to-back burbs. He says it felt as if the whole South had sold out to the asphalt contractors and the burger merchants. And there were then a few little enclaves, he said, of government-owned nature preserves of one sort or another. They were protected from these ugly changes brought about by these millions of people rushing to the coast, while the rest of this area is this, as he says, neglected landscape suffering from government inaction. It says most of the coastal counties were places where people trust only the invisible hand of the market to sort out what should develop and what should not. And then he praised one local government. He said the view from Monticello in Virginia is protected by good county planning. They brought in lots of planners, he says, and that's really the key. Plan. Of course, as Mises points out, it's not plan or no plan. There's the planning by the government or there's the planning by the individual. We're not going to have no planning. That's not an option. So who's going to be allowed to plan? Well, I like uncrowded beaches. I like views of rolling pasture land and mature forests, and I like diversity of birds and other wildlife. I like unpolluted mountain streams. I like to go hiking in the mountains not far from where I live. I like the tannin-laden coastal rivers. I like a lot of these environmental amenities. I don't like to see strip malls and burger joints unless I want what they have to offer, which, in fact, I stopped by the McDonald's on the way over here this morning. So I may not see prospective development as some sort of real estate apocalypse, but I do understand the desire to see part of nature that's left in its original state. Most Americans seem to have similar desires. We go off to resorts where population density is less, and coastal resorts that maintain their protective enclaves and low-density housing and so forth. They tend to do well. The property values there are very high. Been to a place like, say, Kiowa Island in South Carolina. They've made a special effort to maintain the natural environment there. But most of us have to be satisfied with a glimpse of that natural amenity, some sort of little crowded rectangle of public access beach, and a high-density high-rise or condo surrounded by a parking lot. Now, does that mean we're condemned to some sort of environmental or aesthetic monstrosity? Of course not. Now, you can do several things. You can say, well, let's persuade people to change their preferences. Not to visit the beach, or not to go on their vacation at the beach, or not to build a house at the beach. You can persuade people to do that. It's perfectly consistent with a free economy. And if preferences do, in fact, change, then people who still want to go to the beach could do so with fewer impediments because other people decided not to go. That's fine. Another approach would be for people who prefer land to remain undeveloped to purchase the land and then resist the various developers' offers to buy it. Groups like, the Nature Conservancy might do this kind of thing. They acquire land by a gift or a purchase and retain it in an undeveloped or less developed state. Now, this is expensive, but it's certainly consistent with a market economy. Or the government could prevent people from exercising their preferences and just restrict development. Now, that's been done in some cases, but the cost of that is very, very high. It's passed on to taxpayers. It's passed on to the existing consumers of coastal amenities. It reduces the availability of housing. It reduces access to natural attractions. It reduces a lot of the things that we like to have in our society. And if land becomes more restricted, then beaches and other natural amenities would become even more so the domain of the wealthy. There's a concealed elitism here among those who want the government to restrict land use. Who's going to get to enjoy it? It's easy to pick on people like Al Gore, especially now. But I mean, did you read about his new house with I don't know how many, 14 fireplaces or something? I don't know whether he's burning natural gas from the Gulf or whether he's burning trees in his fireplaces, but it's a little amazing. Well, of course, he gets to enjoy the environmental amenities. The rest of us are supposed to change our preferences and avoid competing with him for those environmental amenities. Anyway, if this kind of thing, this urban sprawl, is bothersome to you, then let's look at what the state does to encourage it, because it certainly does. Who runs the sewer lines out to the new developments? Who paves the roads out to the new developments? Who provides incentives to individual homeownership as opposed to renting more dense housing? This kind of thing, this kind of sprawl that people complain about, I don't know what things would look like in a free market, because we don't have a free market in land development. But I think it would be very interesting to see that the subsidization to this kind of sprawl is part of, should be blamed, I think, for part of what's going on. I think it's dangerous to turn over the future of a land to people with elections to win. That's the real danger here. It's not that people have money to make. People with money to make have an incentive to take into account your preferences. People with elections to win, not so much. Well, next. Here, this is the aesthetic sensibility of a state-run economy. I was in Budapest and Krakow and other parts of Eastern Europe, Prague, in January. And you see these sort of enormous concrete people warehouses that are left over from the Soviet era. They're not building these things anymore, but just really ugly. Well, I think they're ugly. Maybe you think they're beautiful, but I think this is really obnoxious. And they're all over the place. I mean, they go on for you have an apartment block that might be an eighth of a mile long. And little cubby holes that people live in. This is the idea of the state, to compartmentalize and control individual behavior and living conditions. Markets do a much better job treating people like human beings instead of some sort of thing to be, some sort of work resource to be boxed away at the end of the workday. Put onto some sort of public transportation at 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. or whatever the work hours happen to be. All right. Here's another one. Corporate scandals prove that capitalism doesn't work. You'll often see people pointing to corporate scandals like Enron or WorldCom, and Moffitt, again to quote from him, says, "There's much amiss with the Western capitalist model because of these corporate scandals." Well, there's nothing about capitalism that endorses unethical business practices. Once these scandals are discovered, typically the market discounts the stock price of these firms. They often go bankrupt, and the market is constantly in the process of discouraging and cleansing out these kinds of behaviors. And unfortunately, some people would like to use these scandals as a way to introduce state intervention. And what do you see after? I mean, I've talked to, I don't know how many students in the last year and a half, 2 years about the financial crisis. And I'm always referring them to Tom Wood's book, Meltdown, and some other works on this that point the finger at where it should be pointed. This is not a market failure. But you get this idea from talking to some people that the reason we had a business cycle is because of varying levels of greed. If we could just sort of measure the greed of bankers, then we could predict the business cycle because that's what's causing it. Suddenly bankers and mortgage agents got greedy, and that's why we started issuing loans to people who couldn't afford to pay them back. I sort of take this self-interest of bankers as a constant. If you want to call it greed, well, it's there. It's been there. What removed the suppressing institutions that allowed this sort of behavior to become antisocial instead of benefiting society? And of course, you can look at the Fed's suppression of interest rates far below their normal market levels. You can look at the activities of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac encouraging bankers and other lenders to ignore traditional credit reporting requirements and creditworthiness requirements. You can look at the Community Reinvestment Act. You can look at a number of these things that Woods mentions in his book, and you can find elsewhere also. This is not a market failure. And, of course, corporate scandals will happen. But, I think there's a bit of a hypocrisy. I put this picture up by accident a few minutes ago, but this is Dresden after the firebombing in World War II. Okay, I mentioned earlier my insurance company, I'm not worried about them killing me. Okay, we're gonna somehow argue that Enron or some other corporate scandal is to be compared with political scandal, with bribery, corruption, war, famine, genocide, corporate welfare, police brutality, deadly regulation, fascism, World War. Really? People aren't perfect. You can't expect them to behave perfectly. And that's a reason not to give governments control over these things. Because then you give them the power of coercion. At least private firms tend to go bankrupt when they routinely defraud people. They go out of business. Governments, they defraud people, they kill people, and they go right on ticking. You can go back and look in American history, and Tom DiLorenzo, of course, has done an amazing amount of work here, and others as well. The United States might be one of the less scandal-ridden governments in the world, but you can look at the Republican Party shunting vast sums of money to incredibly wasteful transcontinental railroad schemes in the 1860s and 1870s, one of the largest corporate welfare schemes to that time. Franklin Roosevelt adding about $4 billion to the federal government's books in 1934 by requiring people to turn in their gold, paying them $20.67 per ounce, and then declaring after he had it all that it was worth $35 per ounce. Very convenient Enron-style accounting. Then there's the Social Security racket. I mean, where do you start with that? The largest government program in the world has a longer life than any other pyramid scheme only because it's forced on everyone. At least in the market, if somebody starts a pyramid scheme on your college campus, you can opt out. Don't have to participate. Well, then you get this, this argument, capitalism is racist and sexist. Employers have an incentive to hire on the basis of ability. Customers have the incentive to take a good deal no matter what the race of the person or the gender of the person who's selling. Store owners have an incentive to sell to anyone. I can point you to a couple of books and articles on this, a couple of them that are recent. One on the issue of segregation in streetcars. Jeff Jacoby, writing on the enemies of Jim Crow, notes that the owners of municipal transportation systems actively resisted segregation. They did so not because they were necessarily committed to some sort of lofty ideal of racial equality or integration, but because economic reasons were driving them to this. Segregation hurt their bottom line. It drove up their expenses, and as the manager of Houston Streetcar Company complained in 1904 to the city council, segregation was causing them to haul around a good deal of empty space that is assigned to the colored people and not available to both races. That's what he says in 1904. So Jacoby says that in many cities, segregation provoked blacks to boycott streetcars, cutting into the company's profits. Private transit companies were trying to scuttle segregation. Jennifer Roback's got an article on this in the Journal of Economic History. They will either ignore the laws or they would actively try to resist them. And so in Jacksonville, Florida, a 1901 ordinance that was requiring black passengers to be segregated was unenforced until 1905. And then the state legislature mandated segregation statewide. In fact, not only was this legislation passed against the opposition of the streetcar companies, but Roback notes that the company's hostility to segregation was so well known that when a group of black citizens challenged the law in court, their attorney felt compelled to deny that they were somehow in league with the streetcar companies. Not many people, not many businessmen prefer prejudice to profits. And there's more here. If you're interested, I'm running out of time a bit here, so I don't want to dwell on this too much. But there's a lot here to suggest that segregation is not a product of market so much as it is a product of governments. You can look at apartheid in South Africa, which was adopted in the 1930s because white workers were incensed that so many blacks were being hired and competing with them in the market. So what do? They run to the government and say, stop the competition. Restrict the better paying jobs to whites. So business was the enemy of discrimination. Government was the cause of the discrimination. Now, there's a lot said on this, and you've already heard lectures on the Austrian theory of the business cycle, but I have to mention that there is another argument against capitalism, that it's prone to bubbles and panics. You can read, this is just 3 of many, many, many books on this subject. Mises, The Causes of the Economic Crisis, and Rothbard's America's Great Depression, and then Murphy's Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. And you go to Mises.org and you can find just gobs of material on this. I don't feel like I've got to spend a lot of time on it because it's so easy to show from these sources that government intervention actually produces bubbles. Intervention to counteract the consequences of a recession actually tends to make matters worse, not better. Recessions are a process of cleansing the economy from the errors introduced by government manipulation of interest rates. 9th, capitalism puts profits ahead of people. So and I'm going to talk about some of this tomorrow. I've got a talk on consumer product safety regulation. But you get this argument that capitalists put profits ahead of people. They'll produce these unsafe products and people get killed, and it's because they were concerned about the bottom line. Well, it's generally not good for your bottom line to kill your customers. It tends to hurt your reputation. People don't want to buy from you anymore because they saw that somebody else that bought your product ended up getting hurt. Now, this is one of the things I have to try to work with my students is to point out that there's this dichotomy between safe products and unsafe products is false. Safety is a spectrum, and extreme safety is extremely expensive, so expensive you wouldn't want it. The perfectly safe car is impossible, but I suppose one that is more safe might look more like an armored personnel carrier that you're driving around. Nobody wants that. There's other things that we like to have, gas mileage and style and performance and capacity to hold passengers and low cost, initial cost, and other things that are important to people. So the task of the entrepreneur is to satisfy people's complex combination of priorities. What do my customers want? I'm going to try to give it to them. And one of the more infamous cases of supposed market failure here was the Ford Pinto. And this is one that was rear-ended. And the argument was that they had placed the gas tank in such a way or constructed the fuel system in such a way that a rear-end collision would be very likely to catch the car on fire. And then there were some tragic cases of people who were killed in rear-end collisions. And Ford Motor Company was brought up on criminal charges because of this. And during the process of investigation, they found that it would have cost them something like $11 to change the fuel system, $11 per car. And Ford had made some sort of cost-benefit analysis and decided that $11 per car was more than people were probably going to be willing to pay to get additional safety. And so they did not make the improvement. Well, you take an $11 improvement, and then there's some other thing that you can do to the car to make it even more safe, strengthen the steel in the frame or add to the bumpers or something. And $11 here and $8 here and $17 there and $24 there, and pretty soon you don't have a Ford Pinto anymore. You got a $40,000 Mercedes with airbags and everything else. Well, some people don't want the $40,000 car. Can't afford the $40,000 car. They want something inexpensive, and they're willing to make sacrifices in safety and other dimensions to get that. Unhealthy foods. I mean, we could go on with this kind of thing for a long time about McDonald's is trying to make us all obese or something like that, and this is nonsense. They're catering to what people say they want. Last on my list here, capitalism leads to the production of objectionable goods and services. Now, I noticed that the new edition of this is almost sold out here in the bookstore. but this is, promise you, just as good, same text, same words. Defending the Undefendable by Walter Block. An old one, but a great, great book for addressing this kind of thing, the production of objectionable goods and services. And I stole this cartoon here from an article that appeared on Mises.org, I think yesterday, drawn out of this book. The subtitle here is "The Pimp, Prostitute, Scab, Slumlord, Libeler, Moneylender, and Other Scapegoats in the Rogues Gallery of American Society." Umpteen chapters here of fantastic skewering of this idea that somehow government's going to save us from all these objectionable behaviors that people engage in. Now Mises, again, in this little book that I mentioned earlier, Economic Policy, he says, certainly there are many people who smoke too much and who smoke in spite of the fact that it would be better for them not to smoke. This raises a question which goes far beyond economic discussion. It shows what freedom really means. And later he says, certainly this capitalistic system can be abused and is abused by some people. It is certainly possible to do things which ought not to be done. But a disapproving person always has a way to attempt to change the minds of his fellow citizens. He can try to persuade them, to convince them. But he may not, says many, he may not try to force them by the use of power, of governmental police power. All right, well, I'm going to stop here because I'm out of time, but if you have questions, I'm going to be out here. We've got to clear the stage for the next speaker, but I'll be happy to talk with you afterward.